starts now. Before I introduce,
well, I'm going to speak mostly about the situation that's happened. There's some debates which are ongoing in India at this point in time. That's the inspiration. But I think India doesn't stand on its own. It's these ideas about this new notion. Again, there's a question of something new, the new notion of inclusive growth. I don't know if it's very, is it oxymoronic or just moronic to think about inclusive growth in a neoliberal kind of a framework like India? But there's a huge consensus around it. So whether you are Narendra Modi or Nitish Kumar or it's Kapil or Bharat, CPM or Mayawati or Mulayam or whoever, they all agree. Manmohan or Mamata, they all agree. And I think when politicians who never agreed about anything, or even about what side the sun comes out, when suddenly they start agreeing on something like inclusive growth, it's time to snoop a little bit and ask, what's going on. And I don't know whether these words mean exactly the same things to each one of them. For some, it might mean that inclusive means that my son and my nephew will be included. And for somebody else, it might be that my social group will be included. And for somebody else, it may be that, okay, we will include, but we will go from the top 5% to the next 2%, maybe something of that kind. And some others might actually be seeing it from the other side altogether, saying inclusion is the thin way of a more Marxist type of an agenda where you're trying to empower people from below. I think all those things are together, but those fights are to be had a bit later. But it does, in the meantime, seem as if it causes a little bit of confusion. I want to make a few general remarks first before I come to this more specific Indian side of things. See, I'm here looking back a little bit in history and in memory. There's no time, so I think everything has to be exaggerated and to be a little bit of a caricature. But one could say, with a lot of justification, that the fundamental tendency of capitalism is to exclude. That is inbuilt into it. Now, this is what you see historically. You see the enclosures as being the basis of the capitalization of agriculture. You see the forms of exclusion are profound. You see for a very long time the exclusion and exploitation of labor. We might say, well, look, but labor's got all these rights, but labor's rights were not granted from above. They were fought for 200 years, enshrined then eventually in various covenants and treaties in the ILO. But I think the images which ring truer are those which are there in Marx and Engels of 1844, of Dickens, of Shaw, Booth's Mayhew, of Roundtree of London, and at the height of the industrial, powerful industrial accumulation phase, you find that there's a tremendous amount of exclusion. So that's the first thought which I want to put on the table, because in some ways, the kind of agenda that we are thinking of investment, whether it's in India, which is a bit more advanced in terms of that agenda of investment, or Pakistan, where you're maybe trying to work out how to get the engine going, there's no direct equivalence, but we're looking at an early stage in an economy which is not fully institutionalized in the sense of a modern economy, but where this accumulation, no doubt, will have exclusions. And this is, so I mentioned this, that in the UK, if you take the first industrial revolution, it took 200 years to get to points where there was some kind of a meaningful, rather large-scale inclusion. If you think of the agenda of full employment, for instance, before you could think of full employment, you had to create people who were separated from the means of production. And that happened over 150 years. But then after that, there's the question of absorbing them into modern form, into full employment. And full employment, as a political slogan, didn't show up till the mid-1920s or the 1930s. It wasn't because you couldn't have a system which macro-managed the overall demand for labor. They would fight for the rights, but when it came to the rate of employment, the system was right until the 30s was actually hamstrung in terms of being able to manage that side. So you had a pretty crisis type of situation where slowly you had these exclusions of the past slowly being overtaken by fighting and struggles from below. And I would like to say that maybe the 1920 to 1950 period is very crucial, and I want to highlight a few things here which become relevant for us. Firstly, democracy. It's in 1918 that there is universal suffrage, that all adults can vote in the UK. Now that's hundreds of years, centuries after the industrial process of accumulation and so on has really been pushed. Exclusions have happened, all the rest of it has happened, but it's without democracy that that process takes place. Now, then you get the war, you get the Russian Revolution, you get the worry, but still the 1920 to 30 period, that period before the Great Depression, is sort of the salad days of the British elite, of British capitals of that kind. This is where they are having a great time, and it shows up in the arts and fine arts and everything else. It's a time of jazz and parties. But things go very rapidly, they change. 1926, and the first general strike, you have the crash, and you have the war, of course, the first one, and people have to be sent out, lots of people died, and so that's linked also to the ground of the vote. Universal suffrage is linked to the end of the war, and that now suddenly starts putting pressure. And you have come at the R, come at maybe the theory as well, come at the man Keynesianism, and it's not for nothing that you have a form of Keynesianism here, which is not just about demand management, but which is what I would call a social democratic form of Keynesianism. As against the data contortion, the distortion, or the seminar in the USA, which John Robinson used to call a bastard form of Keynesianism, where the demand was actually injected into the economy through the armaments industry, through tax reliefs and things like this, which were not part of the social democratic agenda, but which were actually part of the elite capitalist top-up agenda. How can we manage demand but still keep the exclusions? So now there's a big contrast in that sort of regard. Now, I think there were other factors that played the structure of the working class and then small middle classes were coming up and all this. But it is that system which took a very long time with all these different impulses on it. We are trying to crash that into a very short period. If you take modern economic growth now for developing countries, it's like all those slogans we used to have. What do we want? Say inclusive growth. When do we want it? Now. And so everything has to come now, including the environment, human rights, when it comes to sustainability issues, when it comes to poverty relief, everything has to happen in the agenda of 20, 30, 40 years. And I think this is one of the aspects which has to be borne in mind. Now, in it should not be forgotten that what's called the golden age of capitalism in Western Europe, in the OECD countries, is from something like 1950 to 1973, the outbreak of the inflation, the first oil spike. And that's a period where of course, Germany had 1% unemployment rate, and a low inflation rate, and a relatively high rate of growth. Now that could be managed right across Europe, and it could be managed because of some form of social contract, and that's the institutional side, which was inclusive in nature. And that's how that thing could actually work. But once that contractual, that social contract actually collapsed, you do have the rise of what Guy Standing, our friend, calls the precariat. And now that's the kind of a potted background which I want to mention to you. But what sums it up, and I'll give you here a simple statistical kind of a binary. If you look at the EU, you have, as the European Union, you have very high wealth inequalities still at the end of this whole period, but relatively low income inequalities. If you take the USA, you have very high wealth inequalities and high income inequalities. Now, the difference between the two is the fiscal intervention. And I think that's something which you have to bear in mind. If you take for the last 10 years in the EU, you have EU 25 countries in the EU, the statistics for that period. If you take the post-fiscal tax and transfer distribution of income, from there you estimate poverty, which is taken at 50% of the median income. You get poverty rates of about 10 to 15% for most of the major countries. If you take the this is the post-tax and transfer. If you take the pre-tax and transfer incomes, you come to something like 35 to 42, 45% of the population. So it's telling you very clearly that this engine, which has delivered on a modern economy right across Europe, if you let it do itself without any fiscal intervention, you're going to have very high levels of exclusion. So employment generation in that successful model of accumulation, which we've had historically, has been insufficient to absorb people fully through the employment mechanism. And hence the social mechanism which is coming in, which is tax and transfer. Once you do that, you come to bring down poverty rates in a relative sense to acceptable levels of 10-12%, which are in circulation. And I think this puts the finger on the importance of the secondary transfer mechanism to supplement the primary absorption mechanism, the primary accumulation mechanism which absorbs to the labour market through employment, and the secondary fiscal transfer, which picks up and does the rest of the work because the employment side can't be handled exclusively through the accumulation process in the modern economy. Now, I think that particular variation on this, that jointness, is something which is visiting the developing countries, but at a much earlier stage in their accumulation process. And I think that's where some of the problems are coming up. So that's my backdrop to this. There's a lot of real work in this. I won't start mentioning it, but the idea of inclusiveness of growth has been there since William Petty. He believed in full employment. Adam Smith, if you read the theory of modern sentiments and you read the results of nations carefully, not just to see the fundamentalist narrative that has been collapsed into, but really also its qualifications. If you see John Stuart Mill, who strongly criticized, but his powerful idea was that the secondary mechanism was necessary. And he believed that there was a fiscal illusion that if you taxed the rich through indirect taxes, they would notice it. I think they do notice it. There's a question of politics here, but indeed that's the thing which is happening in this mechanism that I've just described. So you could say it's a tree of Mill over Smith, who believed that the absorption would take place through the labour market. Now, I want to come to India and countries like ours, and for that we maybe are better served by a Lewis Kuznets type of a framework. And I think what it shows, if you take the Indian statistics, if you look at the period right through till 2004-5, and the second period after that is about the same as well, in employment absorption terms, what you get, I would call, is a structural stasis, is a structural stagnation. The idea that growth will transform the employment structure of the economy has not really happened. Manufacturing has gone up in the GDP several percentage points. But you see the formal sector as a share of total employment is around 10%. Now that's hardly very much. See, and this is despite having a 9% growth rate in the economy for such a long period of time. Now, this is quite central. So you have an incomplete process. The accumulation is going on very rapidly in India 1, but India 2 is not being transferred into India 1 in any serious rate. Now, there is an idea that people should be allowed to migrate into the cities, but migration is not necessarily productive employment. It's very far away from that. And the so-called demographic dividend really collapses into more mouths to feed and hands looking for work rather than something which is going to all of a sudden generate growth in itself. I mean, that's not being demonstrated, so it's not really a dividend. I think it was mentioned in the morning as well. Now, so what you're getting in Lewis is this. Now, people have used Kuznets very often to say, well, inclusion will take time, it happens over time, and so on. But if you look at the drivers of that first process I talked about, the Industrial Revolution, all the Kuznetian factors are there in it. The structural factors, which are to do with the growth of the industrial sector and so on, the shifts in norms, which are social in nature, is there very much with the change in public policies, with the public investment, and that's what's actually brought those things about. Now, those things are not about to happen, and I would say that the version of the Kuznets curve that we know everywhere is like a downward shaping L curve, but the upper side we have not yet seen. So I think it would be wrong to think that we are going to rely on that for the inclusion. Now, in India, currently everybody believes in, as I said, inclusive growth, and last year there were about half a dozen seminars by the Planning Commission or the ministries, UNDP and so on. Now, what's happening here is that there is some kind of a governmental schizophrenia, in my view. There's one part of the government which really wants to go for growth, and they think, ride the tiger, and this is what will happen over time. I've tried to challenge that by giving an example of history, and I don't think they're about to overtake that very strong historical situation. The other side says, look, doesn't the party want to get re-elected? And if it has to get re-elected, you at least have to signal left, even if you are not quite turning left. But you have to actually absorb these people in some form or the other, and the social mechanisms come into play in that regard. Now, this idea of absorption, how is it panning out? What are they saying? And it's very interesting here, the division which takes place. One of the members of the Planning Commission says, he said in the seminar, do the maths. I'm not interested in these social transfer policies. And nobody's interested in a structural redistribution of assets. They are only interested in some mechanisms in the growth process, some shifts in the growth process which will lead to greater labour absorption. Now, what is that? You go back to the old ideas of labour market flexibility. But labour market flexibility might help you find a job as an individual. It's not necessarily going to create more jobs at a macro level. That's always been the problem with this. So this is the kind of a division on one side. So there are techno people who are looking for this. On the other side was Monte Carvalho, who said in the same seminar, he said this is not a bureaucratic fix. A definition can't be provided by bureaucrats to inclusive growth. It is the idea of building a social consensus, and how much inclusion we have depends on how much is necessary, what government perceives in order for it to be less. So it reminds you of who's the very peasant against in Russia and China. Those people are very peasants who go down that track, who will come in and form an alliance with you to give you political sustainability. That's the notion. And that's what's used by Nancy Birdsall, for instance, when she defines the middle class and she argues that that should be included in the growth process. Now, unfortunately, there are very many versions of this inclusive growth in this. The first one is, as I said, ride the tiger, there's no inclusion there, it will happen over a period of time. The second one is, yes, inclusive growth, but poverty focus. That's what we've had so far. But now we're looking for a new label, we must go beyond poverty. That's the idea, we want to go beyond simply the poverty focus. Those who believe in affirmative action programs representing excluded minorities, so scheduled tribes, scheduled castes especially, they are arguing that inclusive growth really means that, and they've jumped on that whole bandwagon to really demand more resources for the affirmative action program, which the government is also happy to give. But that's again something we've had for a long time. On the other side are movements which are coming from below, which are using the distributive justice language, which are really talking about a rights-driven, universalized framework for access to education, the right to education, the right to information, the right to employment through the National Employment Guarantee Program, and the right to financial capital as well. But they're also talking about the right to down-to food security. I am definitely going to run more by on this side, but thanks for very good. Now, I think that there is a problem here that we are trying to, there is a tension between a perspective which is saying, don't touch the asset structure and don't think about the redistributions, think about only the growth mechanism. I think that's far too narrow a perspective on inclusive growth, on mechanisms for inclusion. And there might be a part of a larger parcel, but this is not going to really deliver. If you look at the transfer process which is taking place, and it's very large, because the programs, and now of course, there's a huge move towards cash transfers, and people want a universal cash transfer program to come into play. And there's a lot of controversy about it. So the instruments of inclusion also are very problematic. What's the difficulty here is it goes back to the fiscal issue to some extent, and to inequality and the political framework. Supposing you say we can tax people and they will all the time transfer this in order to have inclusion, so that the poverty rates can come down and more people can be included, not through the normal functioning of the economy, but through these other things. It raises the question of sustainability here. Raises the question of sustainability. So the entire 70% to 80% of the population is now dependent on transfers on a more or less permanent basis. And I think that's not very on. So we have to look for some framework for inclusion, which while it maintains its right-driven approach, has at the same time some accumulation mechanism, some investment process, which is there not in India 1, which is working very well, but an accumulation process in India 2. And the accumulation process in the India which is left behind is agriculture, large parts of the informal economy, which I think were mentioned this morning by Professor. And there are people who are actually wanting to work but they can't work. And so it is there that we need some variety of intervention. And those are the areas where intervention is very weak. But is there any alternative which is possible? And I think that's the kind of an issue which we come to. Is there an alternative investment process? And people are breaking their heads over it. And I think that there is a constraint here which I also see coming up in the Pakistan context. There's a kind of a relationship between what the state does in investments and kind of a time preference. And the market structures and financialization globally have shortened further this time preference, essentially the time preference of politicians and even of investors, that they want returns in a short period. So when it comes to a longer framework, like we're talking about infrastructure, green development, it requires a certain form of political and contractual and institutional stability, a long-term framework. Therefore, it requires a certain kind of a predictable social embedding of the investment process in society and in quality of governance. And like what this term embeddedness came through Korea, where this sort of a thing was there. And I think that particular embedding of the elite, powerful accumulation engine has happened in India. Now, it's not socially oriented, it's very much capitalist oriented, but it's happened. It's working with the government, and they have generated, passed on a viable accumulation process at the top level. Works for India 1, it's not working for India 2. And in India 2, we are looking all the time for transfer programs. But we're not looking for investment in agriculture. When it comes to the National Employment Guarantee Program, we are treating it as just any old employment, although it's meant to create local assets. Local assets will be locally owned, so that there's no contractual black hole. That will also make their financing self-financing and non-inflationary, which is a very crucial issue, how to make it non-inflationary in this area. And that will be non-inflationary. So I think there are various mechanisms here. People like Amit Bhadri and a few others are fighting this kind of a corner. But the central issue is that everybody, all politicians with their time frame and their own time preference, are very happy to jump on the bandwagon of being inclusive in terms of giving out money. But when it comes to being inclusive in terms of a long-term program of development, very few are being able to, are even interested in that. And I think there's so many other seeking groups which are around it, that they have worked out in their mind that any investment program which comes on, any new program which comes on, is really something that they have to be able to transfer funds from. So this is right down to the village level, where the local GDP which is produced by the village is really, I would say, dominated by, but is competed for very strongly by money which comes into the state. And it all has to be cycled in, and it can be cycled out. So this kind of a rentier framework, which is there in India too, needs somehow to be overcome by some kind of a powerful accumulation framework. And local movements, naturally, the people are demanding the outcomes. They are looking for money, they want education, they want health. But they are not able to, at this time, address the powerful institutional and the investment design issues, the larger macro political issues, and that's the bind between India 1 and India 2. So I think this bind is now so strong that the government has realized that they need to put yet another term, a new buzzword into the frame. So it's not linear at all, it's now inclusive growth. And all these different people are meaning different things by it. And of course, there is a group, as I said, which is very radical, which is looking for an alternative development process, which is an alternative which would be inclusive. They are also part of this kind of a gang of people who are supporting inclusive growth. Now, which ones win out is another matter. I think in the end, you might find that it's a very complex and differentiated picture, but the macro scenarios of investment, I think, have to be extremely clear. And I think we compare it to China, that's, as a closing comparison, I think that's important. You see, China was extremely inclusive in its socialist phase. And because it was inclusive in the sense of land reforms and access to land, it would have an extremely exclusionary growth process. Although it has such powerful manufacturing growth, it still is very exclusionary in many ways, and it's kept people out, but they all have to plan to fall back on. So paradoxically, they've had a high inflation, high risk path domestically, but they've been able to do it because they had initial conditions which were egalitarian for the large part of the population. In India, we don't have that. So we are trying to have a growth rate without the depth of the market, and at the same time without the political sustainability in local areas. So I think it is very crucial at this point in time not to think of inclusive growth exclusively in terms of yet more money coming in through the fiscal mechanism into these programs. Those are important, I believe in them, but to make them productive, both in accumulation terms like the Employment Guarantee Program, but to think of new forms which are sectoral in nature, informal economy, agriculture especially, where we're not thinking of corporate agriculture alone, but smaller farmers who can be made productive. And you have to think institutionally out of the box there. There have to be institutional innovations. Because if we just give the money, it will just carry on with the exclusionary processes which are there in the system. Now, I think the debate has been joined, which is very lively at this point in India, and I think that these are the kind of issues which surely will show up once you've actually broken the backbone of the first primary question, getting the investment process going.